Good morning, everyone. My name is Tiffany Chen from the Newton Needham Regional Chamber. Happy Wednesday, and thank you so much for joining us this morning for this wonderful webinar. Before I introduce you all to our moderator today, I just want to go over a few things. For today's discussion, our topic is on how to build an anti-racist organization. For our chamber, we are dedicated to offering at least one program on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion every month. And with that, we do welcome any suggestions or topics that you would like us to present on in the future. So feel free to drop in the chat, or at the end of this webinar, there will be a survey for you to input your suggestions as well. We certainly welcome them. And throughout this webinar, we will be recording it. So we will be sending out the recording to you all afterwards via a follow-up email as well. And regards to any questions that you may have throughout the webinar and the discussion, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll do our best to address them. With that, I would like to introduce you all to Diana Pichota, President of Dentraline, as our moderator today. Thank you all so much.
Hello and welcome. We're so delighted to have this conversation with you today. In the interest of time, so that we can get to the heart of our conversation, I'll introduce our panelists. First, we have Gimelda Carvello from Wayside, where she serves as the Vice President of People and Culture, as well as the Chief Diversity Officer, and she oversees the newly formed Wayside Equity Training Center. Amy Hogarth is also with Wayside, where she serves as the Director of Recruitment and Inclusion and a key member of the Equity Training Center team. And then finally, Kelly Chun, who is the principal of Kelly Chun and Associates, a long-standing communications consultancy focusing on multicultural communications and cause-related marketing. So with that, we will begin our conversation today. We do encourage you to add questions into the chat or the Q&A, and we will integrate them as we go along in our conversation. That's what creates a lively discussion for our panelists. But Kimel, I'll start with you this morning. We have boldly entitled our panel today, How to Be an Anti-Racist Organization. So let's start with a foundation setting question. What does it mean to be an anti-racist organization?
Well, being an anti-racist organization is really about actively integrating the work of opposing racism and really all forms of bigotry into the fabric of the organization as a whole. And this means changes in culture as well as structure and the institutions that are part of your organization. And then with that internal work, then being able to push that out externally into the impact that you have in the community. And so it's more than just putting out a statement, stating your values or condemning some kind of action or event that happens in the public. It's about actually literally doing structural change and work to actively work against the systems of racism and oppression that exist out in the world.
And we'll dig deeper into some of those topics as we go along. But Amy, with so many organizations just getting started on their work in DEI, perhaps they've focused on diversity in hiring, but equity inclusion work is still early for them. Is it too optimistic, too big, too bold to be striving to be an anti-racist organization from the outset?
Well, I'm going to say no. And I think I'm going to say no because it's sort of, to me, a little bit like, is it too big to strive to be a kind person? Of course not. That doesn't mean I'm always kind. Sometimes I'm not kind. And sometimes I behave as a white person in a way that is racist, because from the time I was born, I came into a world that told me that white people had more power and privilege. So that unlearning and that work is part of my work as a white person doing anti-racist work. I think for organizations who feel the overwhelm of how to be anti-racist, what I would say to them is just start. And I think just starting really is about taking action. One of the things we started to do about a year ago, and we have been at this work for a while, but we put out one anti-racist action a day for our staff to read. And it's literally always an action. There's always something to do. Because I think when you make this an academic process or a thinking process, you're only a little bit in it. This work is, I always say, head and heart work. It's both and we need to be able to think and act and really use our hearts to figure out, as Dr. Hardy would say, how is our humanity and how are we moving our humanity forward in our conversations and our actions.
Terrific. And this has obviously been a year and change in which issues of race, equity, diversity, inclusion, these have been topics that have been front and center in the business world. But Kelly, as organizations continue to move forward and perhaps transition what had been DE&I efforts into more comprehensive efforts to fundamentally change structures and do the work of becoming an anti-racist organization, language matters a lot. How do we talk about this topic internally in a way that brings everybody to the table with some shared language?
Well, thank you and good morning, everyone. I think empathy is a skill that organizations need to cultivate as they enter what is really a brave space and get a sense of how their employees, how their staff want to have that kind of conversation. I think it begins with an acknowledgement that it can be a difficult process, that it's going to be a messy process. And so I think that you really need to start with empathy and by connecting to staff to see how they want to proceed along this path.
Excellent. And I think there is, at this moment in time, there's a lot of content out there about DE&I and anti-racism efforts. You could read a lot of articles, you could listen to a lot of podcasts, and it might lead some organizations to believe that they could DIY their DEI, to use a phrase, and their anti-racism efforts. I suspect, Gamal and Amy, that you might have a different perspective on that. Can you tell us, and either of you could go first on this, what you see as the benefit of having outside facilitators, what their role is and how to use them well, and what challenges an organization might want to look out for if they are trying to do at least some portion of their DEI work in a self-directed way?
That's a lot of big questions. So, let's bring it apart a little bit, or just think about it in a couple of different buckets. I think there's a role here for an outside consultant to come and help give structure to what that process is going to be. I think, if any organization were going to embark on implementing any large scale initiative, most of the time you're going to reach out to an expert in the field or some kind of consultant to give you some structure over there, some resources, and some direction on where to go. And that it's the same, you would apply the exact same logic to a DEI initiative or effort. And there's a part here where you want to have a check and balance, right? We all think we're nice people. And then you go out in the world and someone gives you some feedback that you weren't so nice one time. And, we all think we have positive intentions and we don't necessarily know the impacts that we're having. And so it's really important to have somebody who's going to be able to hold up that mirror to an organization and the people within that organization. There's another part here too, where you want to think about, there's multiple layers and levels of how you want to approach this work. There's a systemic part of this, and then there's individual work that the people who are leading that work need to do, along with the people within that organization. And those levels require different kinds of help and expertise. And so, one of the things that we love about the Equity Training Center is that we do have strategic planning people, and we have people that are really about those interpersonal conversations, and we have people who are kind of in the middle there and things that more outside the box kind of things. And so there's an ability within Wayside to kind of meet people where they are at with that work and provide the appropriate resource to take it to the next level. And so when you are, trying to kind of, and I agree, so many great podcasts, articles, and books that inform us as well in the work that we're doing. But the question is how do you string that all together into something that isn't just one small immediate action, but that there isn't anything to follow up with,
So I think there's another person in Massachusetts who's famous for making a plan. And I think of Gamel as being our person who's also famous for making a plan. And so really what we did is we made a start by making a plan. And our plan has 5 things on it that we really focus on. And these are the 5 tenets we think an anti-racist organization would have. And we're going to tell you what they are, don't worry. The first one, though, is building trust. And so somebody in here is saying, can you give me an actual example of a daily to-do? One of the things is all the ways we build trust with our employees. Something that I had to learn the hard way as a person who had supervised folks is I thought I had a strong supervision relationship with people who reported to me, and I thought they would just tell me everything, but they don't, right? And so the reason people don't is because of power and how power impedes and impacts our relationships and how we can make power more transparent to make it something we can have a conversation about and talk through how to have more equity and more equality. So that's an example of one action you would take. But a more direct action would be if I have a new intern who might be on the panel. Hi, Gabby. And I'm supervising Gabby. And so what I want to do with Gabby is say to her, look, if I say something or if I talk too fast, which I do often, or if you miss what I'm talking about, please come to me and tell me about it. And then if she does that, I have an opportunity to again divide power and say, oh, see, this is this thing. I wasn't clear with you. I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can break it down in a way that's more clear. So just that work is anti-racism. Because it's saying, I understand that my power makes it harder to speak to me sometimes. And I understand I can talk about my power in front of you in a way that you can then say, oh, we can talk about this. We don't have to pretend you do this annoying thing as my boss or as my supervisor, and I'll never bring it up to you, right? So that's a point of anti-racism. Imagine how that would be, how that is for somebody who's a person of color trying to say it to a white person, right? We have all these rules in white solidarity that says, if you're going to talk to me about my racism, you have to do it quietly and never with any emotion. I say throw those rules out. Let's talk about the ways we impact each other racially and be honest about it.
Terrific. Amy had mentioned the 5 aspects of an anti-racist organization that I know are fundamental to your work at the Wayside Equity Training Center. Kamel, do you want to walk through those for folks and give them a sense of how that works in real life?
Absolutely. And I bet you as I say them, Tiffany will put them in the chat. Yes. So don't worry for those of you who don't catch it. So here's the 5 things. First, you want to create trust. And I'm going to go over each thing. First, you want to create trust. Second, have courageous conversations. Third, increase social capital. Fourth, apply an equity lens. And 5th, measure data and hold ourselves accountable. So what does that mean, right? Creating trust. First is an absolute, you can't do this without the organization having a sense of trust, being a place that can see itself as a learning environment. And how do we do that? We do it by having the leaders of the organization decide and set that goal and the intentions of becoming an anti-racist organization, and then communicating that out to the organization and then following through. You know, one of the things that we've learned over the course of this is there's kind of 2 different versions of people when it comes to trust. There's the person who just trusts freely and they give everybody the benefit of the doubt until something happens that they feel betrays that trust, and then you've lost them. You've lost them forever. And then something later magically happens and then the trust comes back, right? There's very limited amount of control that you have with that kind of a thing. And so it's hard to build a plan around that. The other kind of trust is trust with by being consistent and showing follow through on the things that you say. So if I say I'm going to be somewhere at 6 o'clock and I show up at 6 o'clock, you know, the next time that I say I'm going to be somewhere at 5 o'clock, I'll be there at 5 o'clock, right? And if you don't, then people aren't going to trust what you're saying. And so through communication with the organization is how you're going to be able to achieve that. And it's also going to be a lot of small little abstract things that you might not realize when you add them together are greater than the sum of their parts. Mm-hmm. And a year later, you'll look back at the organization and you'll be like, oh, that's how we build trust. These are the ways that this is the action that I did that turns out later was the thing that created the trust in the environment, right? And then what you want to do is, for us, we wanted to really focus heavily on having courageous conversations, and Amy can feel free to jump in on some of this too with the conversations. But for us, really what that's about is having a common language and the permission to use it. And so for organizations, it could be a variety of different ways. It's group rules, group norms, those kinds of things. It's an shared understanding on certain vocabulary. For us at Wayside, we like the Validate, Challenge, Request model for developed by Dr. Kenneth Hardy. We are an organization of clinicians and social workers. They love themselves a model, right? And so you want to do what works for the organization. And the permission to use it means that there's going to be a permission to make a mistake in that conversation, and the expectation that people will then grow and learn from that mistake. I don't know if you want to add anything just to that.
Yeah, I just want to, one of the other things I would recommend if you were looking for what is an action to do is to have a way to start having conversations that make sense to folks. We love Validate, Challenge, Request, and partially one of the largest reasons we love it, other than we love Dr. Hardy, is the piece about validation. Because when you validate a person, it doesn't mean you're agreeing with them. It means you are trying to spend some time knowing what their perspective and their worldview is. And we think that is missing from many conversations in the world right now, particularly political ones. And so we recommend the idea of giving the alternate view a hearing, and then validating and experiencing what you understand makes sense about that view. And then the conversation can move to a challenge and a request. The other thing is having a model and a permission to use it gives people a way into these conversations. So sometimes people literally say, I'm going to have a courageous conversation with you. So you kind of know, you can get yourself ready, like, okay, you're going to say something. It's a little bit like I'm going to give you feedback, but a little warmer. And yet the conversation can be rich. I think one of the pieces is to really work on being ready to have that conversation. Dr. Robin DiAngelo says white people are bad at grappling with things, and I think that's true. And so to get a little bit more comfortable with having conversations that are less comfortable, that are less easy, and being really willing to understand perspectives that are maybe new to you.
And I want you to not lose the thread and get to the other three aspects of building an anti-racist organization, but there's a wonderful question in here about how you can move forward in this work of building trust and having a courageous conversation while you're also trying to repair some harm that may have been done in the past of the organization before there was maybe a full understanding. And how do you not let that sense of pain and chaos continue to marinate and possibly impact the organization's capacity to move forward?
Gamal, can I take this one? Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
So now I'm going to sound like a clinician, because I am. I think you need to take some space as an organization to talk about the pain. Maybe specifically, or maybe generally, it depends on what, kind of things. If there was just many things where people were unseen and unheard and racism was a norm, you could make a list of some of those things and name them. And then I think you honor the pain. You take a minute. We have this thing of one of the things we do when we train is we take 1 good minute. And 1 good minute is to give us a second to just get ourselves ready to be in the training. The other reason we take 1 good minute is to learn how to take a beat when we're in a situation where things are getting hot. I say a lot of times to my kids, let's just all take a beat. Let's all take a beat. And so what we want to do in this situation is take a minute to honor the pain and the loss that happened. And then you ask if people are willing to let it rest and start anew, and or what would it take for them to get there. So I think, again, white supremacy doesn't like to honor the past, as evidenced by how we just got a national holiday on Juneteenth in 2021. I mean, I'm happy for that national holiday, however, the federal holiday. However, it took an awful long time, right? So we're not, normally it's not a norm of white supremacy to want to honor what was painful and lost. There's just sort of a feeling of like, let's pretend it didn't happen and keep going. That actually does not work at all. Ask any clinician or anybody, any minister, basically everyone will tell you, nope, you gotta spend a little time here. So spend some time and then see if people can get an agreement to find another way and another way of thinking, and include those folks who've been harmed in the setting of the agreement. So we also have a general mission statement that we are doing the work to become anti-racist as an agency. So that's a decision we have made, and we made that with many core folks in our agency.
And the only thing I would just add to that real quick is to just own what the mistake was. And by showing the vulnerability and modeling that you're owning that mistake, that in itself sets an example and helps to build that trust. And just like with anything else, right? In apologizing, saying what you're going to do to address it, and then actually doing those things.
We want to bring apologizing back. We want to bring it back. We want a t-shirt. I know how to apologize, right? We literally train that trait in our training, because somewhere along the lines, we got a story that apologizing was a bad action. No, apologizing is a great action. Apologize to your kids, to your partner, to your colleagues. Just apologize. Practice.
Well, and there are some skills to apologizing that have to do with validation and not making excuses. You know, I'm sorry if I offended you. Well, that's not an apology. I apologize, but, you know, I was, you know, caught up in something else and I wasn't thinking. That's not an apology. So you might want to just, you know, give an example, Amy, of what an apology might sound like.
So I just had to do an apology with a work colleague, which was not a pleasure. I don't like apologizing because because I'm human and I don't like to be wrong, and I'm wrong a lot. So I should probably get used to it. So what I did is I said, I did this thing. I named the thing I did. And the impact of that thing on you, I could imagine are, and I named some things. I think you were embarrassed. I think you were hurt. I think you felt like you were bothering me, and that I didn't, and that you were disorganized or didn't know what you were doing. And I can understand how that would have been your impression. And I'm super sorry you felt any of those things. And then the next part I said is there anything else about what happened you want me to know that I'm missing or I haven't gotten right? Can you help me understand anything else I didn't collect in my apology that you want me to hear? And then I have to stop talking, which is of course the hardest part for me. And then after that conversation, the other piece I end with is, I would like to continue to make this amend to you. So I want you to know you can ask me for something, even if it's kind of wacky and different, and maybe it's 6 months from now, and I will remember that I would like to do that as an amend to you. And if there's something sooner or right now you need as an amend, I'm happy to provide it. So an apology isn't just the I'm sorry, it's the what you did, how it might have felt, listening, and then what else I'm going to do to keep changing it going forward. Also, you can say it will never happen again, but only if you're sure it will never happen again. If you're not sure, so like I misspell things, I'm never going to promise I'm never going to misspell things again. It's going to happen again. So I don't say that. I can say I will work really hard to not misspell your name. right? I will work on checking your name next time, right? But I want to be honest about what I'm capable of changing or not capable of changing, because that can also set up mistrust. How's that, Kelly?
That's a great process. You basically described a process. Yeah, thank you.
Gamal, maybe we can loop back to the other aspects of
Absolutely.
anti-racist organization, having talked about trust and courageous conversations.
Yeah, so the third is increasing social capital. And just for those of you who are not familiar with the term social capital means, what social capital is really, it's about all of those small, sometimes big, kind of abstract things that help us in our lives be able to do whatever it is that we're trying to do. And they help us succeed in whatever place that we are. And those things can be, from how long you've been in this location, seniority. They can be education, they can be language. Do you speak multiple languages? Is English your first language? They could be the relationships that we have. Who do you know? If you think right now, I want to do this big giant scale project thing, how can I get this done? And all the things that come up in your head as the things that will help you to accomplish that project, those are usually all forms of social capital. And capital, literal capital money is one of those things too. And there's a lot of ways that people don't necessarily realize where they have gaps in those social capital things, right? Because it's a little bit of a you don't know what you don't know kind of aspect to something. I'll give you a great example. I'm Brazilian. I'm an immigrant, came to the US when I was 5 years old. My parents, had their education in Brazil. When I was applying to colleges, great student, all of those things, how many colleges did I apply to? One, just one. Why? Why would you do such a thing, right? Good student, all of these things, honor roll. Why would you only apply to one college? Because I didn't understand what early admissions meant, right? I thought early admissions is you send in your application, you apply, and then everybody hears back from their early admissions people, and then you apply to the other places if you don't get it, okay? I did not realize until like 2 days before the deadline that wasn't true, and that I was going to miss applying to all the other colleges during this round. I could have potentially had an entire gap year by accident. Okay. And how could I possibly not know that, you think? I went to a good school. I was surrounded by friends who applied to 10, 15 different colleges. They weren't all keeping a secret from me, right? They weren't like conspiring with each other. Don't tell Gamel what early admissions means. They couldn't imagine that I didn't know what it meant, right? But I also didn't have a counselor that went and found me, talked to me about what applying meant and all of these other things and guided me through that process. And I didn't have parents who had previously applied to colleges in America and knew what that meant, right? So I had a social capital gap that potentially could have had an entire lifelong impact on me, right? So what does that mean now when you translate it to a business world and to your organizations?
Oh, wait, Gamel, before you go on, let me do my college for a second.
Sure.
So we like to do this. We do this when we train. I was a senior in high school. I was a terrible student. I hope my kids are not watching this panel. I was a terrible student. I was kind of an out of control teenager, and my guidance counselor had to find me in the school, like literally like hunt me down and find me somewhere to try to get me to apply to colleges. And I applied to several colleges, even though I was not the kind of student who was really ready to go to college. I would have been really well served by a gap year, and made sure that I could apply. And so what I think is that is also a great example of racism, right? Because I was white, and because I had some class privilege, other white people were helping me do something that I couldn't and maybe shouldn't have been doing myself. And even though as a student, I wasn't the kind of student who should be applying to college yet necessarily, Gamel was that kind of student, was a kind of student that any college would love to have, and no one was helping her.
Let me jump in here for a minute, because someone in the chat noted skin color as social capital. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I applied to college a million years ago, I actually played the race card. And I said, well, and remember, this is like during the late 60s, early 70s. And I said, I'm Black, I'm bright. Basically, I'm young, I'm gifted, I'm Black, you need me. You should admit me to your school. I mean, that was really the theme of my essay, because you have to write an essay on why you think why you're applying and why you should be admitted. So I actually used my skin color as social capital, in the sense that I thought, I would be an asset to NYU in this case. But in response to what's in the chat, when they talk about skin color, more related to our conversation now, can you, Amy or Gamel, talk about skin color as a social asset?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's it's a term called colorism, which again, those of you not familiar, it is kind of what it sounds like, right? So this is not just like race-based discrimination, but this is within groups discrimination based on skin tone. And it also falls in line with the overall structural concepts of racism, where in our society, we prioritize whiteness or as close to whiteness as possible, right? And so, the darker skin tone, the more negative impacts on your access to things and all of that. And there can be discrimination within groups related to that. And you can see that actually recently with some of the controversy around the movie In the Heights, where it's a movie that is a majority, almost all Latino cast, but it's about, a very specific population that has, a Black Latino, a large segment of the population is Black Latinos, and they didn't cast any Black Latinos
as major characters.
As major characters.
In the background, right?
Yeah, and major characters. And there's a great quote by, and I'm forgetting the name of the actress, but I'm picturing her, but I can't remember the name of the actress. Or she's an Afro-Latino woman, and she said that when she started acting, she learned very quickly that Hollywood in America likes its Latinos to look Italian and to not look like me.
Yeah.
Rita Moreno.
Well, that wasn't the actress who said that, but
yeah,
that's
she's Puerto Rican. She's not Afro Black
Latina, and so it's a complicated place, right? And I'm a person that's a good example of that. I'm a lighter skin tone, but also my facial features are not as close to whatever a white dominant culture would be. So people know I'm not white, but they don't really necessarily know where I'm from or all these things. And so I get a lot of confusing kind of reactions to me in that way. And so there are places where people don't, where there are impacts to me where I am seen in this other category as not white. And then there are other places where I have more access to things because I'm a lighter skin tone. You know what I mean? And that can be complicated. And as Kelly's example kind of shows too, social capital is very context-based. Yeah. Right? What is it that you're trying to do? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And therefore it's going to let you know which social capital is going to be the most valuable at that time. Right. And that's actually a great way to kind of segue back into how do you apply it into your organization, right? Because organizations, the idea behind this is, what does it take to succeed in your organization? What is the end goal? Like, right? What does success look like in that organization? Is it being a manager? Is it being in senior leadership? Or is it having a high number of clients? Is it meeting certain productivity targets or revenue generation, right? However your organization defines success, think about that and then reverse engineer it for what does it take to get there, okay? And then when you think about what does it take to get there, say, all right, how is it possible that people in this organization are not necessarily going to have those things to get to that level of success? And what barriers are in place? And whatever those barriers are, think about then how to address them in a way that's going to fill in those gaps that the society at large is creating in that social capital. right? So a great example within Wayside is that we have, for us, again, we're a mental health organization and behavioral health organization. And so we're going to need our staff to get access to being independently licensed. An independently licensed clinician of some kind. There's 3 organizations for that. And that's going to be something that's going to be necessary and helpful to then becoming a manager, becoming a supervisor, right? So the barrier there is going to be independent licensure to the success of a promotion for a supervisor or a manager for certain parts of our organization. So how do we fill in that gap? Well, what are the reasons that someone can get independently licensed or not, right? They have to take a test. Who does well on standardized tests in our society? People with tremendous amounts of time and money to study for those tests, okay? So
And
think
who
about
may have tutors and.
tutors, right? So think about the SATs, right? Who does well? The kids can do the SAT prep, who have tutors, who have the time to study. They're not dealing with other pressures in their life, like having to have multiple jobs, right, in order to survive. So for us, what we did is instead of having our employees go out externally to access these kinds of trainings, right, and test prep courses, that would be either out of their pocket or maybe possibly out of this educational assistance account that we have for our staff. We said, we're not going to have people spend their individual money or their personal money on this. Wayside is going to bring in the test prep course to our location. We're going to pay for it ourselves directly, and we're going to have it during work hours and pay our staff to attend the training. So you're not going to miss getting your wages for that day in order to then go to the test prep course, okay? And we have our staff allow our staff to come and do this test prep, and sometimes twice if they need it. And then we dramatically increased the licensure rate for our staff of color by doing this, right? And so then now we have created a bench that has the one criteria qualification that is preventing them from getting that supervisor role. We took care of that barrier for them. So how do you do that in your organizations? How do you think about those barriers? And then you bring in your capital, your resources to support filling in that gap.
And Gamel, that accounts for increasing social capital. That's not under the apply equity aspect to building.
No, I mean, obviously all these things have an equity lens to them, but applying an equity lens is thinking about that one thing, but applying it broadly to everything, right? So it's not just about the gaps. Now you want to think about every type of institution that you have in the organization. And those institutions might be formal processes, but they might be informal things, right? Your hiring process, your onboarding process, that's a formal institution that you have. Your policies and procedures are formal institutions. And then you have to think about your informal ones, right? Does everybody go to lunch at a certain hour, right? When we were all in person, right? Do you all go out to lunch? And at those lunches, do people build relationships with each other? Do they talk about work? Do they make decisions that are going to have an impact on power and projects in the organization? Well, then
where do you eat the lunch? Where do you eat the lunch?
How much that lunch costs, right? All of those are going to be institutions that have an impact on access, have an impact on the overall organization. And so what you want to do is you want to apply an equity lens to all of it. So you want to look at your forms, your procedures, your policies, those informal institutions, and you say, okay, do the people that have the most amount of vulnerabilities in an organization have the same amount of access to this thing the way that it exists now? And if they don't, you change it. And if changing it is not going to work, do you stop it? Do you end it? And do you create a new thing, right? So you want to just think about all of those different ways and just think about it for everything that you do. So we changed our job descriptions. We reduced the unnecessary barriers in our job postings around education and years of experience, and thought to ourselves, why are these here? If they're here for a reason because of a regulation, right? Like that independent licensure, well, then we have nothing we can do about that, right? But if it says 5 years of experience, why 5? Why not 6? Why not 4? Why not 3.5? Who picked 5, right? Where did 5 come from? Did it come out of a hat? Probably, right? So then think about it. What is it about what you're saying in those minimum requirements that's actually true to the job? And what is the minimum requirement as opposed to your ideal candidate? And so we took all of those things and we applied an equity lens and we reduced those barriers, and we reduced that. We now over 70% of our jobs no longer require a master's, and close to half of our jobs no longer require a bachelor's as a minimum requirement, because we recognize in a lot of the roles that we have in our organization that life experience can go a long way, and that getting that degree is helpful and tells us something about that person, but it also is something that isn't completely necessary to being able to get the job done, and that we put the investment in the training of our staff because we want them to do it the Wayside way, not whatever that institution, that college that they went to is the way that they want to do it, right? So there was a priority there that we made a particular decision about prioritizing for our organization. Go ahead, Amy.
I just also want to add to the equity lens. We have a question in the chat about, we did not, a nice call in from, I think her name is Tanya, and she's saying we didn't say our pronouns. So my pronouns are she, hers. Thank you for that call, and I super appreciate it. I really wish we had said our pronouns at the beginning, and I appreciate you bringing that up. And when Wayside, Wayside is one of the first nonprofit agencies with a campus that allowed kids who were trans and who wanted to live in a program where the gender they were not assigned at birth, the gender identity they wanted to be, that they could live in that program. So if they were assigned female at birth, at that time, we were not allowed to let them be in the male program, but if they were assigned male at birth and they wanted to move as a female, they could be in our female programs. And we did that. And after a while, I had been asked at another setting to talk about what impacted kind of talking about trans and non-binary youth. And somebody asked me about what we did in the documentation and what we did in our paperwork. And I said, it's such a great question, because you change the paperwork, you start to change the culture. It sounds a little bit silly, but once we started to write down for people things like gender identity, and we changed that both for our employees and we changed it for our clients. We also made sure all of our bathrooms were accessible. Once we started to do those things, then the conversation became cleaner because everybody understood this is our value system and this is what we're doing. So we really recommend that as an equity lens. Just paying attention to how you document is a really great way to start.
And then we have a couple of questions that I want to be able to get to. So maybe Gamal, talk a little bit about your last aspect of the 5 elements, and then maybe we'll do some of the audience questions.
Absolutely. So this is pretty straightforward. It's measure your data and hold yourself accountable. I don't want to rely on just anecdotes to say, oh, it feels better now or it feels worse now. Well, what does that mean, right? So you want to, it's the last one, but it's actually kind of the all-encompassing one. And you need to do kind of first, right? Because you need to establish a baseline. So you need to understand what are the metrics that are going to show you whether you're making progress in this or not. And that might be turnover and breaking down turnover numbers by demographics. It might be managers of color, right? It might be, well, we do a diversity survey in our organization. So we ask specific questions related to DEI issues, and we measure how well we continue to do on those or not. We also, you might have an employee engagement survey or a staff satisfaction survey that you do in your organization. And what are those results when you then break them down by demographics? Are you even asking demographics when you're asking that survey, right? So you want to just think about what those things are, and you want to say to yourself, what is it going to mean if we are successful at being an anti-racist organization? And for Wayside, it means lowering our turnover of staff of color, which we were able to do. It means increasing our managers of color, which we made tremendous gains in and sustain those gains, still have some places to go on that. And it's also for us, again, we're, behavioral health organizations, we're really all in on that courageous conversations part. That's a culture metric for us too. And so it's something where we, what is this, how comfortable are people engaging in courageous conversations, and how well do they do them? What skill sets do they have in them, right? And for us, that's going to show us whether or not we're getting to that end end goal of getting to being an anti-racist organization.
And before I hop into the Q&A, which there are some good ones in here that we want to get to, I want to point out for the participants that this conversation in and of itself is a wonderful example of the kinds of things that you want to be able to have honest, transparent conversations about within your organization. The same kinds of things that we're talking about here are things that it's helpful if you can talk about with your colleagues, and having a facilitator does allow you to have those conversations when people bring different emotions and backgrounds and histories and experiences with power structures to that conversation. So as someone who has listened to Amy and Kelly and Gamel talk about this before, I've understood that the goal is to have the kind of organization where the things we're talking about here in this panel can be woven into the fabric of the everyday life of your organization. That can be really powerful.
Yeah, and absolutely. And you could do that as well with the metrics. So you want to make sure to be transparent about those too. So it's not just measure it, you know what I mean? Put it on a piece of paper and put that paper in a closet, right? You want to tell everybody where you are on these things and hold yourself accountable by being transparent about those metrics, and share them amongst the staff, so that they know. And when you're not meeting a certain metric, be transparent about that and own that that's where we are and what you're doing to then address it. And I also just want to, for my pronouns are she, her as well. So I just want to make sure to
yeah. And mine are also she, her, and Kelly. Great, thank you. So actually, while we're on this conversation about conversations, how do you cultivate and create this kind of space for DEI conversations? Sometimes it can feel as though, particularly for smaller, mid-sized businesses, for nonprofits, for organizations that are volunteer run, it can feel A, really hard to carve out the space for those conversations, and B, it can feel like it takes a really long time to make progress on DEI initiatives, much less anti-racism efforts. So how do you create the space for those conversations, and how do you make progress on your organization's DEI and anti-racist goals when you're either largely volunteer run or you're a smaller organization?
I think what I would say about carving out space is that it's a little bit like anything that's hard and meaningful, like let's say exercise. And exercise is sometimes hard and also really meaningful to positive health, right? And so part of it is a decision and a plan, and then doing it, right? So there's like, we also know this about voting, right? If we want people to vote, if we help them make a plan to vote, they're more likely to go vote, right? So I do this with exercise all the time. Like I set out my running shoes and my running like chain for the dog, because I use a special chain for him, and whatever. So I know that I'm going to go run. And the same is true for conversations. So when you set a space, whether it's a space virtually or maybe we could have a space in person, you want the space to feel like it's reasonable, that there's time, that there's a sense of this being important. One of the really important things we're very grateful for is the leadership at Wayside, and not just their support, but their true leadership on anti-racism work. And so basically our CEO completely has been at the forefront of this work and really a leader in this work. And that's really mattered to all of us. So I think those are some of the ways you start. And then the other piece is you set some guidelines. So we have guidelines about how we have these conversations. One of the most important is we really seek to have a brave space, but not necessarily a safe space. I don't necessarily think I can make it safe for other people because I don't know enough about them to know what that would involve. I trust that if I make it a brave space, that people will be brave enough to take care of themselves if they feel unsafe. And I also suggest that sometimes we use the word safe when we actually mean uncomfortable. And when we're uncomfortable, we're growing, and we should get more comfortable with uncomfortable. Another t-shirt. So those are some of the ways we want to do it. The other thing is, like anything important, I am a semi-runner and I'm a terrible, slow, sloggy runner, but over time, I always get better. And so the same is true for anti-racist practice. It's a practice. And I actually really think of this as daily work every single day for me to work on. And I really, come along with us, because that's what it really is a work of being able to be present for it, look at your work as an anti-racist and how you can really have impact in the world. And if you do that in a way that's genuine, people want to make the time. They want to have this conversation. They want to deepen. I think at the beginning is the hardest part. I hate beginnings. I never like to start anything. I just want to be in it. So I recommend getting yourself to the fun place, which is the in it.
And I think Amy has addressed a couple of aspects that tie into two different questions that we have about having conversations that feel appropriate for a workplace setting, with questions of unprofessionalism, inappropriate harassing, possible actual safety issues. And I'll take a pause here. This is not my area of expertise, but I know that from working with a number of different businesses on HR related communications issues, trying to create an environment where different communications styles and ways of sharing information, and the fact that emotion does exist when it comes to this topic, particularly for people of color, as they are sharing their experiences and their perceptions, and helping people understand that there are different models and that those models are not necessarily unprofessional, and looking at things through the lens that Gamel was talking about earlier of how am I defining what's professional versus what's uncomfortable. That's not, I'd welcome Gamel or Amy to speak to that, but I have noticed a significant number of challenges for businesses come at that intersection of differing styles and perceptions of what is professional and appropriate in the workplace.
Yeah, so this is actually one of these great places where the chief diversity part of Gamel and the HR part of Gamel come together. So here's two parts of this thing, and this is where you want to think about this as a both and. People are entire people, right? And when they come to work, whether they're talking about it verbally or not, they are existing in a world where these things are having an impact on them. Okay. When Charlottesville happened, and then all of the things that happened in the aftermath of Charlottesville, I know that it was on my mind. It was distracting me from being able to focus on my work. For an entire week, I was like in a place of like not really being as productive as I could be. Whether I talked about it at work or not, or my white colleagues heard me say anything about it or assumed that might have been on my mind, it was, right? So what we're saying is, let's acknowledge that people are full people. And whether you are personally hearing something or not, doesn't mean that it's not impacting people. And so you want to be in a place where you can actually verbalize and have those conversations. So what I did for my staff is I came in and I said, hey, I know this thing is going on, and I know it's impacting me, so it might be impacting you. So if you are, please feel free to talk about it, and we'll, navigate it together, and we'll see, we'll try to process that together, right? And at the same time, here's where HR Gamel comes in. There are absolute limits to things that people can say at work. Like, you know what I mean, right? So, there's very clear things that are discrimination, right? That are harassment, and you can't allow those either, because you do need to create a work environment that people feel safe to come to work. And there have been situations where clients have said certain things to our staff that potentially put them in a dangerous place, right? And our staff, being our staff, want to do everything to help the client, and they're like, no, it's not about me. I want to make sure that they get this. No. They just said something that I don't know if you giving them a ride to somewhere is going to end in a place where you show up with a burning cross somewhere. I don't know that based on what they just said to you. So we need to think about the safety concern here. Now, there's a safety concern conversation that you want to have, and that's important to think about. But if there isn't an actual literal safety concern or a harassment concern that is very clear and concrete, Then you want to think about what's that in between there, that's that gray nuance area where now it's a time for learning, right? And a time for self-reflection. And so there's a spectrum of conversation that can happen in a work environment, and we want to make sure that we don't cut off the productive and positive versions of these conversations that can lead to a better culture, a more engaged staff, and a better business outcome for your organization, right? For the sake of fear, for the fear of uncomfortableness, right?
Oh.
So you want to balance those things, and at the same time be clear about what the boundaries are on fully inappropriateness or a safety concern.
And we don't have a lot of time, but there's also the whole spectrum of microaggressions as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually the majority of where the stuff that comes up at work falls, right? You know, knock on wood, hopefully we're in an environment here where most of our work environments are not having people saying things, well, I'm not hiring Black people because they're Black. That would be really bad. That's unacceptable, right? So that's a non-negotiable, right? Most of the issues come up in the realm of microaggressions, where people are making comments that they're not understanding are having that impact. And you want to then again, like I said, fall into more of a place of a learning opportunity for people. You want to say it's not okay, but you want them to grow and learn from it.
And we have so many questions and 4 minutes left, so we're going to try and maybe squish in 2 more. One person asks how we can take accountability and help an organization drive forward when the organization is in a place where people aren't even yet comfortable talking about what the wrongs are, what the harms were, for fear of retribution, et cetera. How do organizational leaders take a step back and do that self-examination, hold up that mirror, so that they can welcome people to the table and have them know they're truly interested in having that real conversation and that it's not a window dressing conversation?
Yeah, I think that's all about understanding your ability to oppress and understanding oppression and the power of oppression. And that is the work of all leaders, I think. I think leaders need to get really comfortable with being transparent, being honest, being direct, and being clear. So that doesn't mean you tell people only what they want to hear, which is the mistake I think a lot of good-hearted leaders sometimes do. They say really warm things, but they can't really deliver, which is also an impediment of trust, right? What I think real employees want is the truth. I think we all just like the truth. And so just tell the truth and maybe start with yourself, right? Especially white leaders need to take a look at their places where they have maybe not noticed the effects of their own privilege and power in the work. So if we could set aside race for a second and just the power of being the boss, the person who signs the paychecks, the person who can fire. When my kid first met Gamel, the first thing he said to Gamel is that your boss? I said, yeah. And he looked at Gamel and he said, can you fire Amy? And Gamel's like, yes, but I hope I won't have to. But that's the truth, right? So really, that's the truth. And my kid heard that as what it was, the truth. So we do this thing where we're like, oh, don't treat me like a boss. That's a mistake. You are the boss. You get to decide some things and do some things the other person doesn't get to do. Just be honest about it. So that kind of conversation and that kind of self-evaluation is first. Then that self-evaluation with other people in the same level as you and maybe the same race as you. So we have affinity groups at Wayside that are really helpful. We have a white activist for anti-racism group, and we have people of color. We have 2 people of color groups, and we're I think starting a 3rd. So the idea is that we have times when we all come together, but we also have times when we separate, because there's separate issues for people of color and for certain kinds of ethnic backgrounds and races, and then there's certain work for white people to do around their privilege.
And I think with that, we are just about out of time. I do know that the Chamber circulates the link to these conversations after they're done. We also have a list of resources that Amy and Gamel and the team at Wayside compiled that are quite helpful. The Wayside Equity Training Center is a place that you can reach out to for more information. They have a wonderful website with great resources. And we're so grateful to the Newton Needham Chamber for inviting us here today, and always appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you all so much, Amy, Gamal, Kelly, and Diana, so much for sharing your insight and expertise with us this morning. And as Diana had mentioned, that we will be sending out this recording to you all afterwards, along with any additional resources that were mentioned beyond this webinar. With that, I also want to thank again to all of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Series sponsors of the Chamber. And thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. And hopefully you'll enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Be anti-racist.
Oh, Amy, we love you.
Thank you all.